not that big a deal. Just tell me how many peaches were in the can. And he said, Your Honor, there were only 4 peaches in the can. And the judge said, okay, fine, I sentence you to 1 month in prison. That's 1 week for each of the 4 peaches that you stole. He said, thank you, Your Honor, that's fair. And before that gavel could come down, a voice from the back screamed out, Your Honor, I'm this man's wife. He also stole a can of peas. So, y'all need a second on that one? There have been many interesting courtroom scenes over the years. That one is fictitious, but there have been many interesting courtroom scenes over the years. If you're like me, you get captivated by some of these court cases. I watched, it seems like every second of the O.J. Simpson trial, Casey Anthony, George Zimmerman. I was even glued to the impeachments of both Presidents Clinton and Trump. Just last night, we were talking about Watergate. How many of y'all remember watching Watergate every day when you got home from school or work back in the 70s? That was before my time, but I've watched Watergate too, trust me. I get glued to some of these fascinating court cases. Some have great implications for our country, for people that are involved. But to me, the most important court case there ever was the time that Jesus stood trial for the alleged crime of him claiming to be the Son of God. This morning, we're going to look at Jesus on trial, and I invite you to Matthew chapter 26, if you have your Bibles. And we'll also get into chapter 27 here in a minute. But we're going to look at Jesus on trial today. We're going to look at the 4 different phases of his trial as he was moved around to appear before different people. Now, I'm sure you know the outcome of that. I'm sure you know he ended up going to the cross. I'm sure you know that he even was sent into a tomb, but he didn't stay there very long. In fact, on the 3rd day, he walked right out of that tomb in victory. But before we get to the cross, before we get to the tomb, I want us today to see Jesus standing on trial. And so if you have your Bibles in Matthew 26, we're going to begin by looking at the first phase of his trial, and this is Jesus before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. If you're in Matthew 26, let's look together, beginning in verse 59, what the text says. Matthew 26:59 says, Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, You have said so. In Mark, he simply says, I am. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes, and he said, He has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? And they answered, He deserves death. Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? The first phase of Jesus' trial here takes place before a man named Caiaphas and a council known as the Sanhedrin. In your Bible, it might say the council, it might say the Sanhedrin, but this group that Jesus stood before was the governing body in Jerusalem with authority over religious matters. You remember what was going on at the time for Israel? They were oppressed by the Romans, so the Romans ruled over them, but as a concession they said, we'll let you guys have your little Sanhedrin. We'll let you guys still make all your own religious decisions. And so the Sanhedrin was called together to make decisions governing matters of religion in Jerusalem. And they were presided over by the high priest, who here happens to be a man named Caiaphas. The Sanhedrin was similar to our Congress in some ways. In fact, they had a 2-party system like us, whereas we have Republicans and Democrats who can seemingly find no middle ground. They had 2 groups known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who likewise had no common ground, although in the New Testament we see a few times when they were able to agree, and it was only that they wanted to destroy Jesus. The only time these groups could ever come together was when they were trying to get rid of Jesus, to trick him, to trap him, to stone him, to crucify him. And so here they have now assembled together. They call in Jesus to stand before him, and you see the text that we just read. It says they called him in at night. Remember last time we were here in this text, we saw that they were out in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas Iscariot has arranged to betray Jesus. They come by night and they arrest Jesus. So here we see he's whisked immediately away to his trial. Well, it was against the law for trials to take place during the night, but that didn't stop him. In fact, what is the next illegal thing that they do? It says they go out looking for what kind of witnesses? False witnesses. They are proactively looking for people that will say something about Jesus that isn't true. They are looking for liars. They're trying to find people who will perjure themselves. They're trying to find anyone that will say, oh yeah, I remember that one time when he did this or he said that. The problem, though, with liars is it's hard to get people who are lying to have their stories line up, isn't it? You know, when you're telling the truth, you only have to remember one version of events, right? If you're telling the truth, you just tell the truth. If you're telling lies, you have to remember who you said what to and what details you made up. And according to the law, they needed 2 witnesses to agree together. So evidently outside the council, they're trying to find anybody, whether they're paying them, blackmailing them, trying to find any 2 people that will agree together on something Jesus had done. When they finally find 2, they bring him into the council and say, look right here, listen to what these witnesses have said. And what was the alleged crime? He said he's going to destroy the temple. Have you ever wondered how that was even possible? In the first century, how does one person destroy a building like the temple? Was he going to plant bombs inside it? Is he going to fly airplanes into it? I mean, we know how people could do that today. In the first century, how's one man going to destroy a building like the temple? They said he's going to destroy the temple. That right there is enough reason to crucify him. That's blasphemy. Now, had Jesus ever threatened to destroy the temple? Of course not. What did Jesus really say? He told the crowds listening, he says, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it back up. I will raise it back up. He said this temple, speaking of the temple of his body, a very common analogy. You might say, well, hang on. Jesus made it confusing. Jesus could have just said my body. Well, in the New Testament, the body was commonly referred to as a temple, a tabernacle, a tent, something that was not permanent, something that was movable, something that was temporary. And Jesus was speaking about his body, saying, you will destroy this temple, but in 3 days I will raise this temple back up. Of course, that's exactly what happened. This is not anything blasphemous. Jesus was simply telling them what was going to happen. You're going to destroy this temple. Jesus remained silent through it all. Pilate demands an answer of Jesus. Aren't you going to speak for yourself? Do you have nothing to say to these accusations? And he remained silent. I think one of the reasons to remain silent is when people are lying about you, and then you address the lies, you only give legitimacy to the lies. If people are accusing you of something so outrageous, don't even give it the time of day. Jesus just saying, I'm not going to address that. I never said I was going to destroy the temple. And he remained silent. But I think the ultimate reason he did that was to fulfill what Isaiah had already said, that the suffering servant would be led as a lamb before her shearers who remained silent. So Jesus is fulfilling prophecy even on his trial, choosing not to answer these allegations that are brought against him. But eventually Pilate says, I'm putting you under oath now. You legally have to speak to me. Are you the Christ? And Jesus says, you have said so. In other words, he says yes. He's answering in the affirmative. Yes, I am the Christ, but he says, next time you see me, you're going to see me coming with the clouds of heaven. If there was any ambiguity, it is now gone. Does Jesus think he's the Christ? He is now quoting from Daniel chapter 7, a prophecy that everybody knew referred to when the Messiah would come. Jesus says, next time you lay eyes on me, Pilate, I'm going to be coming with the clouds of heaven. And that is where we are right now, waiting for the return of Christ. The next time we see Jesus, he's going to be coming with the clouds of heaven. By quoting Daniel 7, he is undoubtedly saying, yes, I am the Christ. Make no mistake about it. I am the long-promised one. So what does Caiaphas do? He turns around and he rips his own clothes, tears his robes. Now, if you've never torn your own clothes, that was something that people used to do in those days when there was extreme emotions, angry, sad, frustrated, and they would rip their clothing. But Leviticus 21 said the high priest was never allowed to rip his own clothing, one of the many laws that were violated during this trial for Jesus. So turning to the council, Caiaphas now violates protocol once more. He looks at the council and he asks them to give an answer out loud. What do you guys think? Guilty, they say, deserving of death. According to the law, they were supposed to vote by secret ballot, then bring in the scribes, and the scribes would count those ballots. Caiaphas skips all that, and he makes everybody just yell out loud what they wanted to do, another law that was broken. They mock Jesus, they spit in his face, they slap him, all because they just simply hated him. This is the first phase of Jesus' trial. Caiaphas now believes that he has Jesus on the record condemning himself. So the next thing to do is to carry out the sentence. So we now move to the second phase of Jesus' trial. He now moves from Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin to now before Pontius Pilate, the governor of the region. If you flip ahead to chapter 27, Matthew takes a break from the trial. He talks about Peter denying Jesus, talks about Judas taking his own life, and then he picks back up with the trial beginning in verse 11. But who is this Pontius Pilate that we're about to see? Who is this governor that Jesus stands before? Pilate was the one that was from the Roman government in charge, really ultimately in charge of the Jewish people, not their high priest, not their council, not their Sanhedrin. Pilate was the one who ultimately had the power to decide capital punishment cases. The Jews could not carry out capital punishment. They needed the Roman government to do that. Now, if you're thinking about it, you might think, wait, what about Stephen? They didn't get Pilate to agree to stoning Stephen, did they? They just stoned Stephen right on the spot because they didn't like what he said. So this shows us, again, they had no problem violating their law, but they wanted to be very clear here that Rome is going to bear the blame for the death of Jesus. They want Pilate to be the guy who forever condemns Jesus. Jesus was still very popular. All those who had been fed by Jesus still liked Jesus. All those who had been healed by Jesus still liked Jesus. All those who had heard a great portion of his teachings, they still liked Jesus. Those who had been set free from the stigma of their sin, those outcasts, those prostitutes and tax collectors whose lives had been changed, they still liked Jesus. The council hated him. So they said, if we want to get rid of him, we want to make sure Pilate is the guy that they blame. So they drag Jesus before Pilate, and they want him to be the bad guy here. So let's look what happens now in verse 11 of chapter 27. It says, "Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus, again with the same answer, he says, 'You have said so.' But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer." He'll speak to Pilate, but he's still ignoring the chief priests. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Pilate was in no mood to hear this case. For starters, it was probably about 5 a.m. Pilate was probably sound asleep when they came banging on his door with this prisoner. Got the guy up out of bed, brought him a prisoner, and they gave no formal charge. "Why are you bringing me this prisoner?" And John tells us that they sarcastically said, "Well, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you." Well, that's still not a formal charge, is it? So Pilate doesn't appreciate them playing games with him. He realizes that they're trying to use him for their own ends. So why doesn't Pilate just say, "Get out of here. You let me go back to sleep. Bring him to me tomorrow when you guys have a real charge"? Why doesn't Pilate do that? Well, Pilate was on very thin ice with the Roman government. Pilate knew that he could not withstand one more complaint about him. Pilate had already had 3 strikes with the Roman government. First of all, Pilate had ordered that Caesar's face was carved onto the shields of his own soldiers. That was idolatry to the Jews, and they went over his head and complained about him, and the emperor said, "Okay, get rid of the shields." But then he did the same thing a second time. He had Tiberius's face, the emperor, carved on the shields, and again, they appealed to Caesar, and Caesar pulled rank and said, "Pilate, get rid of the shields." Well, then the third time, Pilate steals money from the temple treasury, and he uses the money to build an aqueduct in Jerusalem. And the Jews were furious because he'd stolen money from their treasury. And so there was a protest. You know what Pilate did this time? He sent his own henchmen out, undercover, dressed as civilians, into the crowd. And whenever people were protesting against Pilate, these people would pull daggers out of their cloaks, and they savagely and brutally murdered all those that were yelling about Pilate. And word made back to Pilate's bosses once again. Pilate knew if these people so much as tell his bosses, "We're bringing prisoners to Pilate," he won't even listen to us. He won't even hear us. Pilate knew that he was toast. And as much as he did not want to touch this case, his wife had asked him not to do it, as much as he wanted no part of Jesus, he knew that if he chose not to, it would cost him his job and possibly even more. So Pilate's not in the mood to hear the case, but he doesn't really have any choice. He listens to Jesus, and he asked him, you guys have got to give me a charge. In Luke chapter 23, they say, well, here's the charge. This man doesn't pay taxes. Was that the charge that they'd brought in the Sanhedrin? No, they said he was going to destroy the temple. Now they tell Pilate, because when you bring up taxes, this concerns the Roman government, so they're outright lying. This man doesn't pay taxes. Was that true? Did Jesus not pay taxes? Well, we know that Jesus paid taxes. Render unto Caesar those Caesars. We also know that when it was time to pay the temple tax, he sent Peter out and said, catch a fish, open its mouth. The first thing Peter found was a coin used to pay Jesus and Peter's temple tax. We know Jesus paid taxes. These are outright lies again. He doesn't pay taxes. Well, Pilate questions him. And Pilate says, I find no fault in this man. So the council told Pilate, well, he has been stirring up trouble from Galilee all the way here. When Pilate hears Galilee, his ears perk up. He says, I've got it. I've got a way out. If this man is a Galilean, he's not my problem. He is the problem of Herod Antipas. So now we get to the third phase of Jesus' trial. He is now sent before Herod Antipas. Pilate passes the buck. He kicks the can all the way down to Herod. See, Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great. Remember Herod the Great? He was the one that ordered the execution of all the baby boys after Jesus was born in an attempt to try to kill Jesus at a young age. This was his father, Herod the Great. When he died, all of his territory, King Herod's territory, was divided up and given to 4 different people. So Herod Antipas, his son, is not the mighty king that his father was. He was called a tetrarch. He only ruled over Galilee and Perea. He's also the one who killed John the Baptist. So Jesus was not a big fan of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was not a big fan of Jesus. So Pilate, though, when he hears Galilee, he says, he's Herod's problem now. Y'all take him to Herod and let Herod decide what to do with him. So this is only found in Luke 23. You don't have to turn there. But in Luke 23, Jesus goes and he stands before Herod. It's a very brief account. And Herod asks him questions. Jesus refuses to answer. And that's that. But once again, Herod says, you're going back to Pilate because I find no fault in you. That's a familiar phrase in these texts. No one able to find any fault in Jesus. You know, when you're innocent, nobody can really find any fault in you. When you've never done anything wrong, what can they really accuse you of? Jesus is a spotless lamb, and no one's able to find any charge, anything that they could lay against Jesus. So the interaction with Herod is very brief, but Herod says, you're going back to Pilate. So now we get to the fourth and the final phase of Jesus' trial, where he stands before Pontius Pilate once again. If you're still in chapter 27, look in verse 26. It says this, then they released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, they delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus, this is Pilate, they took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him, and they stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and they put a reed in his hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit on him. And they took the reed, and they struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, and they put his own clothes on him, and they led him away to crucify him. Herod sends him back to Pilate, much to Pilate's dismay. He thought he had gotten out of a jam, and here comes Jesus again. And he's thinking, now what am I going to do with this guy? And he gets an idea. And Pilate says, wait, guys, we have this custom. Remember at the feast, at Passover, I get to release one of the prisoners to you. So he thinks that he's going to pick the absolute worst prisoner that there was, Barabbas, and then put Jesus next to him. Do you guys want me to release Jesus, this guy you say doesn't pay taxes? Or do you want me to release Barabbas, this violent robber, this insurrectionist, this man who has probably murdered or at least physically harmed people? Which guy do you want roaming your streets, this alleged tax cheat or this violent criminal? And Pilate's thinking, problem solved. They're going to pick Jesus to be released. And then they're not going to complain about me, but That's not what the people say. Who do you want me to release? And they say, free Barabbas. Shocked, Pilate says, well, what do we do with Jesus? And they began to yell, crucify him, crucify him. Free Barabbas, crucify Jesus. This backfired on Pilate. Now he's released a violent person back into the streets. If anybody's going to complain about him to Rome, now they really have something to complain about. He has freed Barabbas. And the crowd is shouting over and over, louder and louder, for Jesus to be crucified. There's nothing Pilate can do at this point. Well, there is, but he's a coward. So the only way that he can save his own skin is to give the people what they want. Pilate has water brought to him. He sticks his hands in the water, symbolically saying, my hands are clean. He says, I wash my hands of this case. But he says, you take Jesus, you scourge him, and you crucify him. What does scourging mean? Well, that was the cat of nine tails, the 39 lashes from the cat of nine tails. Many people didn't survive when they were scourged with that cat of nine tails. The blood loss, the internal organ damage, as it would rip the skin away from the flesh, as those the bones and the sharp things that they tied into the lashes, as they would go into the organs of the person being whipped, as Jesus would lose so much blood and be near the point of dehydration. He's been up all night. He's not eaten or drunk anything. And as he's losing this blood and losing his fluids, as he's being beaten, Pilate is thinking maybe, just maybe they'll think, okay, that's enough. We got our pound of flesh here. We watched him bleed. We saw him get hurt. Maybe they'll say, okay, all right, give the man a break. Pilate says, I'm going to release him to you to be scourged, but they demand that he be crucified as well. And so the text simply tells us that he was led away to be crucified. Next time we pick back up here in Matthew, we're going to see the crucifixion of Jesus. Today we're not going to get into that. We're stopping with just his trial, but I want us to think about what all they had to do to get to this point. What they have to do to get a conviction here of Jesus. Last semester, Matthew wrote an incredible paper. You remember, Matthew, the paper you wrote? On all the laws that they violated in order to get this conviction from Jesus. All the lies that they told, all the laws that they broke. I thought about reading Matthew's paper here, but I just decided not to. But can I paraphrase just very quickly? I thought it was brilliant. But listen to all the laws that they broke in order to get this conviction from Jesus, in addition to the ones that I've already said. There was no formal charge ever made against Jesus at the time of his arrest. We have that same law today. You can't just handcuff a person. You have to charge the person when you are making an actual arrest. They never did that with Jesus. He was immediately whisked away to his trial without the ability to mount his own defense, which was against the law. They knowingly used perjured witness testimony that they likely paid for. They did not allow Jesus to call a single witness at his own trial, which he had the legal right to do. They put Jesus under oath, forcing him to condemn himself, which violated the law, similar to our Miranda rule. You know that right you have to remain silent, where nothing you say can be used against you? You can stand up and say, I'm guilty of sin, Your Honor, and not be found guilty, because you cannot condemn yourself with your own words. But they forced Jesus to do that. He had a similar Miranda rule that they violated. They went to an immediate vote of blasphemy without discussing the charge, where the law required deliberation. Because that was their most serious offense, they would not vote on blasphemy until they broke up and then came back together. Meeting before dawn was illegal. Capital punishment cases required 3 days of prayer and fasting before anyone would cast their vote on a death penalty case. Obviously, that didn't happen with Jesus. On and on we see them breaking the law in order to condemn an innocent person. Doesn't this continually speak to Jesus' innocence? You don't have to do these things. You don't have to manufacture evidence when a person is really guilty. You don't have to do all these things if Jesus was really a blasphemer. What was his accusation? What did he really do that got under their skin? He told them that he was God. So if Jesus was really God, then the record would speak for itself. The fact that they're having to make up all these other things shows that they're not going to be able to win the case, proving that Jesus was not God. I mean, my goodness, he's raised the dead. He's given sight to the blind. He's taken a few pieces of bread and fish and he's fed tens of thousands of people. He's walked on water. We've seen him commit these miracles over and over and over again. If he's not God, we have some real explaining to do. In reality, it wasn't that they didn't think he was God. They knew deep down he had to be God. They just didn't want him to be God. He was not the kind of God they wanted. And I think that's where most unbelievers find themselves today. I'm an atheist. No, you're not. When we talk about someone being an atheist, we're supposed to think that they have looked at all the evidence, and after spending all this time investigating, they have come now to the mental conclusion that there is absolutely no God anywhere in the universe. Give me a break. How can you look around and think there is no higher power anywhere? In reality, I submit to you that most that claim to be atheists are just willful atheists. I don't want there to be a God, therefore I say I don't believe there is one. Why don't people want there to be a God? Well, how many gods could there possibly be? We would probably all agree we can weed out all the statues, all the idols that people have bowed down to, and we really are only left with a few options on the table. There's the God of Islam, there's the God of Christianity, the God of the Bible. Most other religions are really mindsets and way of living. Buddhism doesn't believe that Buddha is a god after all. They believe in inner peace and nirvana. They don't believe in some other higher power. If we're to talk about which God is really real, well, I'd think the one that made the universe is the real God, right? I think the one that spoke it all into existence would be the real God. So which one is that? Well, now we're getting into the God of the Bible. If he spoke this world into existence, he is without a doubt a God. And if he's God, what does he say? Well, he says he is the way, the truth, and the life, the only way to heaven, the only way to the Father, that there is no other God beside me. He also says that not only is he Lord and demands to be worshipped as such, he's also the judge of all the earth, before whom one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And so people look back and say, well, I don't want anybody to tell me what to do. I don't want anybody to tell me how to live. I don't want anybody to tell me what to do with my money. I don't want anybody to rule my life. Therefore, I don't want the God of the Bible to be my God. Therefore, I now say, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. Oh, you believe in God. You just don't want a Lord or a judge. And I believe that's where most people really find themselves that are not Christians or unbelievers today. I believe this. I don't care if you're curious, if you're a skeptic, or if you are a hardened atheist. I believe that if you seriously do what Pilate did, do what Herod did, investigate him, check him out, weigh the facts. I believe if you look in, you will conclude, I find no fault in him. You will conclude that he is who he claimed to be, the Christ, the Son of the living God. For example, Lee Strobel decided he was going to do just that. An investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, Lee Strobel, said, I'm going to write a book that proves that Christianity is just a bunch of garbage, that the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales. And the more he studied, the more he investigated, the more interviews he conducted, he ended up instead writing a book called The Case for Christ, and then The Case for the Creator, and The Case for Faith, and The Case for the Real Jesus. He's an apologist today who defends Christianity. Josh McDowell did the same thing. I don't believe any of that, and I'm going to write a book to prove it. Instead, Josh McDowell wrote evidence that demands a verdict. C.S. Lewis did the same thing. An agnostic. I'm going to write a book that disproves all that stuff. Instead, he wrote Mere Christianity, then the Chronicles of Narnia, and dozens of other books that defend the teachings of Christianity. Nabil Qureshi, a Muslim, said, I'm going to write a book that proves Islam is the light and Christianity is a bunch of garbage. Instead, he wrote Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. On and on and on we can go with people that said, I'm going to investigate it. And the more they investigated, the more they were turned to the truth of Christianity. If I can quote Bobby Bolware for just a second. And Bobby Bolware says, I like to read what other people are saying, but he says, the more I read their stuff, the more I believe in God. The more I read what the evolutionist says, the more I believe God created the world. The more I read from other religions, the more firm I am in my convictions that Jesus is the Christ. So here's my challenge to you, unbeliever, skeptic, atheist, agnostic, whatever you want to call yourself. And maybe not just in this room. I hope we're all saved and born-again believers. But maybe for those of you watching at home today, my challenge to you is to just investigate them, to just check it out, to do a little research. And I believe that if you look for yourself, you will find that Jesus is the Christ. Let me tell you 4 places to start, and then we'll close. If you want to investigate Jesus, let me give you 4 topics where you can do some research, and I believe you'll be convinced. First of all, I believe that God is the creator of the universe, and I reject any theory that says we got here apart from the sovereign hand of God who said, let there be, and then there was. I believe that the more you look at it, the more you will be convinced that we did not slowly evolve over billions of years, but about 6,000 years ago, God spoke everything into existence. Thermodynamics proves it. Everything you can look at in science really proves it. But let me just tell you one thing. Think for just a second about protons and neutrons. How we were taught from a very young age that they repel each other, right? Like things attract and opposites attract and like things repel. The positively charged protons, the negatively charged neutrons, they repel each other. So every single atom in the universe should be an atomic bomb. Protons and neutrons should repel each other in such a way that everything just blows up. Nuclear physicists have no explanation as to how the atoms have been formed, and more importantly, what has held them together. There is literally no scientific explanation as to what holds everything together, but I have a theory. Colossians 1 says, in him all things were made, and are you ready for this? In him all things are held together. Using the very language of today's nuclear physicists, all things are held together by Jesus. One day John says, I looked and behold, the skies were rolled back like a scroll. I believe one day Jesus is going to say, I'm not holding it together anymore. And I believe that when he is done holding it together, the first earth will pass away and that new heaven and new earth will descend, that holy city from God. But you just look into the fact that God is creator, and I believe you will be convinced. Look at fulfilled prophecy. Look at the scriptures. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Zechariah, David, and Moses. Look at the prophecies that existed for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. Some of the older ones existed for thousands of years before the Bible, this New Testament, was ever given to us. For hundreds or thousands of years, we had prophecies, and Jesus fulfilled every single one. Now, there's some that he hasn't got to yet, those second coming, Daniel 7, the clouds of heaven. He'll get to those later. But every one he could have fulfilled in his first coming, he absolutely did. The mathematical odds of this happening. One mathematician has said, if you were to cover the entire state of Texas in quarters, knee high, and take one quarter, put a special mark on it, throw it somewhere in the state of Texas, and you get one shot, you reach down and pick up any quarter you want, the odds of you picking up the quarter with the mark are the same odds as one person fulfilling every Old Testament prophecy, and Jesus fulfilled every single one of them. I haven't run those numbers myself. I wouldn't know how. I'm just telling you about a study that I read. But Jesus fulfilled every one of them, and some say, well, yeah, but he went around intentionally fulfilling the prophecies. Well, how did he control that he was born in Bethlehem, according to Micah 5:2? How did he control that he was born to a virgin, according to Isaiah 7:14? How did he control that while he's on the cross, they're gambling for his clothes? How did he control that a sponge would be lifted up to his lips? How did he control that he was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver? How did he control that although he was crucified between criminals, that he would be buried with the rich? How did he work out all those details? He did so because he's God. Investigate the fulfilled prophecies, and you'll believe the same thing. Investigate the empty tomb. If you look into the empty tomb, I believe that you'll find that Jesus is the Christ. The conspiracies about the empty tomb, they started immediately after the resurrection. And if people didn't believe that Jesus had really risen from the dead, all they had to do was roll the stone away and say, y'all take a look for yourselves, look at his body, and then we can put this whole thing to bed. If they could have done it, they would have done it, but they couldn't because Jesus had walked right out of the tomb. The tomb is empty, and it forever has been. And just simply study all the people that say, well, the disciples stole the body. The same Peter who swung a sword, aimed for a neck, and hit an ear, that same Peter supposedly overpowered Roman soldiers. The same Peter, so scared, he says, I've never met the guy, suddenly took on the Roman soldiers, professional killers, and stole the body of Jesus. Give me a break. The tomb is empty because Jesus walked right out of it. Consider martyrs' testimony, martyrs' witnesses. That same Peter who swore up and down he had never met Jesus, because he didn't want to be crucified with Jesus. How did Peter die? He was crucified, wasn't he? Why was Peter suddenly able to be crucified later when he was so scared about being crucified before? Something about seeing a dead man walk out of a tomb that would shore up the faith of any one of us. Peter had seen the risen Christ. He watched him die, and he watched him walk out of a tomb. Peter had seen Jesus, and he was willing to die. You say, oh, martyrs die for their faith all the time. People are saying Peter stole the body. Last chance, Peter. You tell us where you hid the body and we won't crucify you. And Peter says, I can't. I watched him with my own eyes. He's ascended up into heaven. If I knew where the body was, I'd tell you. But I'm telling you, he's in heaven today. Peter died for his faith. James was impaled by the sword. John was exiled to Patmos, and on and on and on. These guys who had seen Jesus rise again said, you're going to have to kill me because I will never deny what I have seen to be true. Think about the conversions, not only of people like Jude, the brother of Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus, the children of Mary and Joseph, who spent their adult life saying, Jesus, would you knock it off? You're embarrassing the family. Stop telling everybody that you're the Messiah. Jesus, you're embarrassing us. Oh, how did those guys die? They became preachers. They became writers of the New Testament because they were in the upper room when the doors were locked, and Jesus walked right through and, Thomas, get a load of this. Look at these nail holes in my hands and feet, Thomas. Mark in my side where they put a spear through my body. And Jude and James were there. And they themselves became believers, and they turned their lives around. Think about people like Chuck Colson. I mentioned Watergate earlier. Chuck Colson was the first person to go to jail for his role in Watergate. Chuck Colson was not a good man. He was called Richard Nixon's hatchet man. That was his nickname because he was the guy that did all of Nixon's dirty tricks against his political enemies. You know what happened to Chuck Colson? During his 7-month prison sentence, he gave his life to Christ. And when he got out of jail, he was never the same. And for decades, I'm not talking a couple of weeks or a couple of months, for the rest of his life, Chuck Colson lived his life as a Christian apologist and writer. He founded a group called Prison Fellowship International, and he went around the world preaching in the name of Jesus. Nixon's hatchet man, preaching in the name of Jesus and putting chaplains in prisons all across this country. Saying if we can get more prisons to preach in the name of, chaplains to preach in the name of Jesus to inmates, more people can be turned around. Not repeat offenders when you give your life to Christ and get out like Chuck Colson did. And then finally think of, well, no, that was the last one, the testimony of changed lives. So those are those 4 things. Think about Christ as the creator. Think about him as the one who fulfilled prophecy. Think about the empty tomb and the testimony of martyrs and people whose lives changed. You investigate for yourself. And I believe that you'll find Jesus the Christ. So let me say this and I'll be close. 2 minutes, Bobby. 2 minutes and I'll be done. And I mean it when I say 2 minutes. To say that you don't believe in God just because you don't want there to be a God is like saying someone doesn't believe in speed limits just because they want to drive as fast as they can. And don't y'all think about me right now. Y'all are the ones who drive slow. It's not me driving fast. But imagine someone saying, I just don't believe in speed limits. I want to go as fast as I want. No one's going to tell me how slow to drive. And that's fine. Drive as fast as you want to. And it may work out great for you until those blue lights start flashing in your rearview mirror. And you're pulled over and you're confronted with the reality that speed limits do in fact exist. You don't have to like them, but you can't deny them. And you let that officer write you a ticket and show you the reality of the consequences of living as if the laws don't exist when in fact they do. Isn't it better to just drive the speed limit, make it home safe and sound at night, and not have a ticket to pay and an insurance bill to go up? I know that all too well. But think about it like this. Isn't it better to just bow your knee in submission to Jesus today and to make it to your eternal home safe and sound at the end of life? You might say, no one tells me what to do. Well, fine. But one day you may hear these words, depart from me, you that practice lawlessness. I never knew you. Away from me into the hell prepared for the devil and his demons. Is that what you want to hear? Drive like speed limits don't exist and you just pay a fine. Live like Jesus doesn't exist and you'll find yourself in hell. Look, I don't want that for anybody. Jesus doesn't want that for you. He died so you don't have to go there. Just accept the reality, the truth of who he is. Do what Herod did. Do what Pilate did. Investigate him. Check him out. If you don't know that Jesus is the Lord and Savior of your life, then we'd love to talk to you further. I'll stick around like we did with Drew last week. I'll talk to the last person that's here to answer any questions you have, but don't leave this place if you don't know for sure that if you died today, heaven would be your home. There's too much at stake. I'm going to ask you to stand, please, where you are this morning. I don't drag this thing out. I don't try to manipulate it and use emotion. But if you know right now that you need to give your life to Christ, come do it. The altar's open. We'll pray with you. We'll talk to you. We'll answer any questions that you have. We thank you as always for tuning in and being a part of our online service from wherever you're watching, at home or wherever. Thank you for tuning in here today. As always, if you ever have any questions about whatever we discuss or whatever we talk about, I know you're not able to come down to the altar and have anyone pray with you like you might be able to if you were in person. But we would love to pray with you or answer any questions that you may have, so feel free to either send us a message here on our Facebook page, or else you can contact me personally by calling my cell phone at 426-3706, or go to my personal Facebook page and send me a private message there. We'd love to hear from you, and God bless you, and I hope we get to see you sometime soon.